Welcome everyone this afternoon to our panel on terrorism, collaboration, and transgression in Vichy, France. I'm Shannon Fogg. I'm going to be the chair and commentator today. I'm a professor at Missouri University of Science and Technology. I'm going to introduce all of our panelists as they go up to speak, and we're going to start today with Gayle Brunelle. We kind of have, nope, you changed it? Okay, all right, then we will start with Annette Finley-Croswhite. Annette and Gayle actually co-authored two of our papers. Annette will read one and Gayle will read the other. Annette Finley-Croswhite is professor of history at Old Dominion University. She is also trained in the 16th century as well as working on the 20th. Her first book was on Henry IV, and she is currently working with Gayle on the assassination of Marx d'Ormois and synagogue burnings in France during the Second World War. She will be presenting a paper today on terrorism and the hard edge of the extreme right in France, 1936 to 1942.
I'm just going to say briefly that originally Gayle and I were going to co-write the paper she will present. We had someone drop out of the panel, and that's why we co-wrote another paper to sort of be the intro to the one that she will present. So we saved the panel, but you get an awful lot of... Anyway, what was the meaning of the violence, large scale or small, that surged to the surface sporadically in the interwar period? This is a question that French historians are beginning to grapple with anew. After many decades of accepting the verdict of an earlier generation of French historians that violence in interwar France was rare, unconnected with true fascist movements, and for the most part of little danger to the French Republic, historians are beginning to rethink the meaning and the significance of this violence. Scholars are re-examining the veterans' riots in France of February 6, 1934, or the Clichy riots of March 16, 1937, as well as other types of small-scale violence, bombings, assassinations, and even fist-fighting in the streets and meeting halls. Such a reconsideration is, we argue, overdue. We take this position for two reasons. First, interwar violence grew significantly in both numbers of incidences of violence and in scale, to the point where it was becoming apparent to ordinary French men and women, as well as their elected leaders, that something had changed. Can we afford to dismiss their perceptions? If not, how do we make sense of them? Second, before, during, and after the war, prominent French politicians and intellectuals insisted that interwar violence was directly linked to France's inability to prepare adequately for the German invasion. After the war, many people who were in a good position to know, including Léon Blum, leader of the Popular Front and prime minister when much of this violence broke out, and Charles Serre, the author of the official report to the National Assembly in 1946, assessing the causes of the fall of France, both argued forcefully that there were direct links between the interwar violence and the French defeat, and that the French extreme right, as violent terrorists, had posed a real and abiding threat to the French Republic. Serre explained, quote, "The Republic lived in the hearts of people in our provinces and suburbs. But those who represented it in our parliamentary assemblies were not able to break the neo-fascist current. We were forced to rediscover in the dark days of 1940 strange resurgences of the climate of February 6, 1934. The men who at this time rose against the Republic gathered again around Pétain to realize their anti-parliamentary projects through the defeat," end quote. Léon Blum in particular stated on a number of occasions that the Third Republic only narrowly escaped being overthrown in the 1930s. Blum was not exaggerating. His perception that far-right extremism posed the gravest threat, not only to the Popular Front, but also to the Third Republic, was quite accurate. Many French people were drawn to fascism. Given that Blum's opponents on the right, with German help, created the Vichy regime, we take his views seriously. To make this interpretation viable, however, we have to begin by thinking about what terrorism really is, interpreted here as message. In essence, terrorists seek to send a message through their violence, and the message thus becomes more important than the violent act alone. Unlike military commanders, terrorists don't intend their violence to win battles through the deaths of their victims. This was especially true in the 1930s, when terrorists usually targeted specific victims instead of a site that might produce mass carnage, more typical of terrorists today. The goal was to create the maximum impact on the survivors, the witnesses to the violence, or those influenced by propaganda generated as a result of violence and negotiated in the public through the media. The terrorist message response dynamic included an extremely sophisticated bidirectional rhetorical dimension that could influence public action for years to come, as the meaning of the message was communicated, inculcated, decoded, negotiated, redirected, and recoded in multiple ways. Historians interpreting this violence today continue the process of recoding the message. Too often in historical explorations of terrorist actions, scholars focus on the immediate impact in terms of body counts and retaliatory measures, with less emphasis going to the anxiety-inspiring message the terrorists conveyed, or the success or failure of that message played out over the long term. As a result, terrorist acts that do not immediately lead to military actions or political change tend to be underestimated in terms of their ramifications on political discourse and political climate. This assertion underscores Chris Millington's observation that historians have understated the broader significance of political violence in interwar France, and we concur and add that this is especially true with regard to terrorism in the 1930s that went beyond the, quote, propaganda by the deed associated with 19th century anarchism. Historians in general have tread lightly with the subject of terrorism, leaving most discussions up to political scientists, with the possible exception of the study of anarchism. This paper examines the use of terrorism in 1930s France by one of the most notorious and misunderstood groups of political radicals on the far right, the Comité Secret d'Action Révolutionnaire, or Cagoule, whose members perpetrated terrorist acts in 1936-37 as part of their unsuccessful, prior to the war, bid to overthrow the Popular Front government of Léon Blum. Former Cagoulards regrouped during the war to achieve their political goals in a reincarnation known as the Mouvement Social Révolutionnaire pour la Révolution Nationale, or MSR. The MSR reprised many of the same terrorist tactics they had employed in the interwar period and against many of the same targets. The Cagoulard leadership, and subsequently that of the MSR, consisted of extremists expelled from the Action Française in 1935 for advocating direct action in favor of the national revolution. They argued that mainstream leaders of the French right were all talk and no action, and criticized in particular the failure of the Action Française to take advantage of the immense violent anti-parliamentary street riots of February 6, 1934, to take the next step and overthrow the Republic entirely. While the Cagoule leaders disaffiliated themselves from others on the right whom they perceived as too timid or inept to follow them or follow through on their rhetoric, they nevertheless emerged from the right as a more violent and emotionally energized manifestation of it. The message the future Cagoulard took away from the riots of 1934 convinced them that violence was the answer. They viewed themselves as the most determined shock troops in France, ready to use terrorism to engage their moribund society. Their leader, former naval engineer Eugène Deloncre, who's pictured here on the right, stated that his Cagoulard wielded an iron discipline and were ready to sacrifice their lives for their vision of France. Cagoulard theorist Aristide Cour wrote in his diary, "There is no solution other than terrorism." End quote. Historians have largely dismissed the Cagoule because of their failure to bring about a coup d'etat. Even so, we argue that the Cagoule's sophisticated use of terrorism in communication, theater, and propaganda, and their contribution to the violence engendered in France before and during World War II needs reconsideration. In the midst of the competition on the right for political ascendancy in the 1930s, the Cagoule captured an important position as the violent hard edge of that right through their use of terrorism. Reminiscing in 1941, Deloncla reflected that the Cagoule was the nucleus for a, quote, political climate, end quote, that functioned as a necessary precursor to the wartime national revolution. Ideologically, the core beliefs of the Cagoule resembled those of other far-right groups. Cagoulards despised Jews and Freemasons and privileged the values they perceived as inherent in a traditional Catholic and agrarian French national culture. They distrusted the liberal democratic institutions that were the legacy of the French Revolution and perceived the Republic as secular, immoral, and weak. Their greatest hatred, however, they reserved for socialist and communist, who they conceived were determined to foist Bolshevism on France. They saw themselves as at war in the 1930s, and some among them at least felt that their natural allies in that conflict were the followers of Franco, Mussolini, and even Hitler. They aimed to foment terror in order to demonstrate that Third Republic France, especially under the Popular Front, was essentially ungovernable. This, they hoped, would shift the tide of popular opinion, and especially the French military, against parliamentary democracy and lead to a military-led coup d'etat akin to those of Italy and nationalist Spain. Although some Cagoulards longed for the return of the monarchy, most sought to replace the Third Republic with an authoritarian government modeled on those arising in other Latin countries of Europe. Wealthy bankers and industrialists like Eugène Schuller, the founder of L'Oréal, ensured that the Cagoule was amply funded. The American embassy in Vichy kept a close eye on the Cagoule émissaire during the war and reported that by 1942, Deloncla was personally receiving 750,000 francs per month from French industrialists and another 500,000 francs per month from the Germans. These Cagoulards were wealthy and had significant international connections. The brilliance of the Cagoule, and one way in which it resembled many more recent terrorist movements, lay in its clandestine construction. That structure divided the rank and file into cells, units, battalions, regiments, brigades, and divisions. Few members had any idea what kind of group they had joined, as there were no horizontal ties linking cells. So while a cell leader reported to his unit commander, there were no actual relationships between cells. This structure enabled Deloncla to control the kind of information given to recruits. Most recruits believed they were joining an auto-defense group to ward off a communist coup. This was the most important use of information control on the part of the Cagoule. Deloncla made it clear that low-level recruits were never to be told that he and other Cagoulard leaders planned a coup d'etat that might well place him as the head of a new government, even as he sought in his public persona to emulate Mussolini. Communicating with the public by perpetuating terrorist acts was the most powerful way that the Cagoule engaged French discourse. The year 1937 was busy for French police in large measure because of Cagoulard activity. On the morning of January 25, Russian economist Dmitry Navichin was stabbed to death in an avenue of the Bois de Boulogne. The Clichy riots seriously disrupted Paris on March 16, 1937. 2 months later, on May 16, Laetitia Troreau, an attractive Italian immigrant, was killed in the Paris metro. The next month, on June 9, two Italian immigrant brothers, Carlo and Nello Rosselli, were assassinated on a country road in Normandy. On September 11th, two bombs, and there's a picture here of this. On September 11th, two bombs destroyed buildings housing business offices in the 16th arrondissement of Paris. These and a series of other violent provocations were eventually linked to the Cagoule. Marc Stormois, Blum's interior minister, tied Jacques Corrèze, third in command of the Cagoule, to the Clichy riots. Another Cagoulard who had been among the rioters at Clichy, Jean Filliot, also the Cagoul's chief assassin, killed Navachine and the Rosselli brothers. Cagoulard gunrunner Gabriel Janté was likely an accomplice in the murder of his lover Taureau. Affiliates from a southern branch of the Cagoule in Clermont-Ferrand set off the bombs here, pictured here near Étoile. Navachine seems to have been executed for the sheer shock value, while Taureau was a police informant and killed for her treachery. The Rosselli were prominent anti-fascists whose execution was arranged with Mussolini. These high-profile murders and other atrocities the Cagoule committed in 1937 contributed significantly to the growing political instability that many French people believed was ripping France apart. Delangle called such provocations, quote, warning shots across the bow, end quote, explicitly designed to manipulate the public even while the Cagoule stockpiled weapons in anticipation for the coup he was certain would result. The press kept the Cagoule in the news by searching out new angles to exploit the public's thirst for sensational stories, stimulating fear and confusion in the process. All of this turned the public gaze towards violence in anticipation of the next action. The Cagoule well understood the divisions between supporters of the left and the right in French public opinion in the 1930s and used violent actions to polarize further their society in order to weaken support for the Third Republic. Joel Blatt states, quote, fomenting violent disorder as a means to call for order, the CSIR trumpeted a communist peril in which they at least partially believed and sought as a pretext to launch a coup d'etat, end quote. Using the communist threat as a pretext, Delangle tried but failed to provoke an insurrection in mid-November of 1937, and a few weeks later on 23rd November, Dormois publicly exposed the Cagoule to the press. Left-wing papers like L'Humanité immediately produced articles about the complot from which the government had narrowly escaped. Le Populaire went further and blamed the entire right for complicity in the conspiracy. But the French government was slow to move forward with the case against the Cagoule, probably because they did not want to alarm the public further with revelations about the Cagoule's foreign connections in Germany, Spain, and Italy, or stir up trouble in the army where the CSIR had found many of their recruits. As a result, the right-wing press that had originally denounced the bombings on September 11th as communist conspiracies now embraced the Cagoule by portraying them as victims of the police and calling for their release. L'Action Française, for example, declared that the government's imprisonment of Cagoulard leaders was nothing less than a plot against the entire right that had been staged by the Sûreté Nationale. Baptizing their version of this anti-Cagoulard plot Fantôme Marx, the right-wing papers accused Marx Dormois, the Minister of the Interior, of deliberately using scare tactics to drum up support for the socialist communist politics. Thus, the right dismissed the Cagoulard threat as little more than a left-wing conspiracy designed to damage the right. Many people were confused by the charges and countercharges in the papers, while others began to appear at costume balls dressed as Cagoulard, sporting telltale hoods and holding fake bombs, contributing further to the street theater the Cagoule now restaged as left-wing farce. Letters poured into the press and to the government demanding their release. Ultimately, the right-wing campaign against the left was successful, and most of the Cagoulards who had been arrested in 1938 were released in 1939, not tried until 1948, and with the exception of a few who were almost all living in asylum outside of France, received light sentences that many never fulfilled. Terrorism is a complicated attempt to communicate messages to society at large. The Cagoule hoped to use violence as a means of promoting disorder in France in 1937 in their bid to resurrect a right-wing conservative state, even a fascist one. Joel Blatt says that the Cagoule plot to bring down the Popular Front marked the, quote, climax of acute political and social ruptures, end quote. Each message to the media that the Cagoule sent, whether through an act of violence or through the publicity surrounding their arrest, contributed to the social state of anxiety in which France was engulfed. And as the terrorist message got constantly repackaged, who knew what to believe in by 1939? Through violent means, the cagoule thus contributed seriously to the political discourse of the pre-World War II era, and their acts of terrorism and even their potential for terrorism, as revealed in their exposure, as well as the various interpretations in the press of their agenda, reveals the complex discourse disguised as political shock theater. By 1939, France was seething with internal conflict, and the cagoule was in large part responsible for creating a political climate that destabilized the Third Republic. As Delangle believed, he had turned ideas into action. It would be useful, therefore, to consider the cagoule in terms of how well they promoted a right-wing agenda that had serious ramifications in French history. In 1937, when Marx d'Ormois exposed the cagoule, his police found in their hideouts armbands bearing the letters CGT and SFIO, additional evidence that Corrèze and other cagoulards had been the real provocateur of the March 16, 1937 Clichy riots, one of the most serious examples of interwar violence in France. Clichy was the political nightmare of Blum's administration, a blow from which his government never recovered, and one that ended with d'Ormois being portrayed as the assassin, while the public questioned how the First Popular Front government could have ever justified firing at its own supporters, the thousands of workers in the crowd. Shifting the blame from Corrèze to d'Ormois bespeaks a level of political sophistication heretofore unrecognized. From that point on, Marx d'Ormois was a marked man. Arrested in 1940 for refusing to support Pétain's government, d'Ormois was put under house arrest in Montélimar. He arrived in Montélimar with stacks of documents tied to the cagoule investigation of 1937-38. On July 26, 1941, cagoulard agents working for Eugène Delangle assassinated him, silencing forever the cagoule's main critic. The documents disappeared as well, offering further evidence that the cagoule knew how to both shift the discourse and cover the trail. During the war, the cagoule émissaire continued its violent agenda. Many former cagoulards, well known to Pétain in the 1930s, headed to Vichy and surrounded the Maréchal in cabinet positions and as part of his special protection squad, while Delangle stayed in Paris as an active collaborator with the Germans and supporter of Laval. There, his cagoulard émissaire followers formed a division of the Commissariat Général aux Questions Juives, who specialized in raiding Jewish apartments and businesses. On 2-3 October 1941, Delangle and his men blew up 7 synagogues with explosives supplied by the Germans, using bombs once again to send another message to France, this one tied to their vehement anti-Semitism. Delangle's mark on French history and that of his cagoulard, however, was not insignificant. Indeed, he helped to orchestrate the failure of the Popular Front government, articulated a fascist message that nearly generated civil war in 1930s France, and contributed to the growing anti-Semitism in France that ultimately pulled France into the Shoah. At each juncture, he used terrorism, provocation, and arms smuggling to promote his right-wing agenda. Delangle clearly understood the articulation process of terrorist activities and their image on target audiences, or their impact on target audiences. What he failed to say with words, he said effectively with guns and bombs, and in the process legitimated a form of political discourse that conditioned expectations of terror. Viewing the cagoule as the hard edge of the right, who operated as effective strategist, offers a reinterpretation of the spectrum of violence perpetrated by the far right in France in the 1930s and acknowledges terrorism as the message.